In 2014, I was a young academic, well, maybe not so young, but I was an academic in Australia, focusing on human rights in Asia. And at the time, I actually wrote a book chapter in French on the situation of federalism, human rights, and minorities in India. And that chapter was rather written in glowing terms. I mentioned, for example, how India, despite its many challenges in terms of its size, diversity, social and economic divisions, nevertheless had in place numerous positive measures in its constitution, in its legislation, to address many of these challenges in a way that I consider to be reflected reality on the ground and to try to find the right balance to address the needs of different diverse populations, including those populations that represented minorities. I was quite proud of what India had accomplished, and this was summarized in English in the following way, and I quote myself, by the way, I don't do that very often. India has managed to preserve, despite poverty, the unity of the country. This has been obtained by the formal recognition of its huge linguistic and cultural diversity and the accommodation of this diversity in a fair and equitable manner. Today, almost 10 years later, I could not, as a United Nations Special Rapporteur on minority issues, in all honesty, reach the same conclusion. There is an obvious and disturbing trend in the increasing allegations concerning India that are being submitted to the United Nations Special Procedures in the last 12 years or so. Just to be clear, special procedures are thematic and country-specific mandates, which, amongst other, deal with complaints of violations of international human rights, such as freedom of religion, racism and racial discrimination, freedom of expression, and many others, including, obviously, my own, the mandate on minority issues, which include ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. And in the data that we have for the years 2011 and 2023, and I chose this period, by the way, because there is an online search function site of the United Nations Office for the High Commission for Human Rights, which actually gives you all the communications, the public responses to allegations of violations of human rights at the UN. And that's very accessible to those who would be interested. The trend between 2011 and 2023 is unmistakable and striking. While for the first few years, if you look very closely, there really are only a handful of cases, what we call communications, that deal with minorities, just a few, really only a very few number in the first 3 or 4 years of that database. But by 2022, or since, let's say, the 1st of January 2022, we've reached a point that almost all of the communications that we have, the complaints, if you will, of violations of human rights, 11 out of 13 that are published, all of those involve minorities, the allegations of denial of the rights of minorities. One has to dig sometimes to see the forest from the trees in this data, because in some cases, the minority dimension isn't immediately set out. In fact, quite a few of those cases deal with human rights defenders. And it doesn't actually specify that the human rights defenders whose rights are being denied, and this can be quite serious, are often, usually, as a matter of fact, defenders of the human rights of minorities. But they were treated just generally as human rights defenders. So if you scratch a little bit of the surface, you realize, and it is quite a change from the situation around 2011, 12, and 13, almost all of the cases of serious massive violations of human rights that are submitted to us at the United Nations concerning India involve minorities. There are quite a few of these cases, just to perhaps be more precise, that involve human rights defenders who have been defending the rights of Muslim minorities, Sikhs, Dalits, and Adivasi, indigenous people who can also constitute members of an ethnic, religious, or a linguistic minority at the same time. In some cases, the alleged violations of human rights are absolutely massive. We're not talking about 10 victims. We're not talking about 1,000 victims. We're not even talking about 10,000 victims. We are talking literally, in some cases, of millions of people, millions of members of minorities who are directly affected in some of these allegations of violations of human rights. Think about that for a moment. One allegation involving millions of individuals, and this is occurring more than one time. So let me repeat so that we understand the scale here, but also the systemic nature of what is occurring in India. When you have millions whose citizenship is denied, millions whose rights to political participation and representation are curtailed, hundreds of thousands whose livelihood and that of their children is threatened, it's hard to conclude that this is not part of intentional policies by authorities. What sometimes is omitted, however, and even we at the United Nations sometimes, in my opinion, don't acknowledge this and focus on this sufficiently, is that the main targets of these massive violations of human rights, the main victims, are usually, mainly, overwhelmingly, specific targeted minorities. As myself and other colleagues have concluded, we're seeing massive discriminatory legislation and policies, often on the grounds of religion, ethnicity, even occasionally on language. And that's what's involved, as I've warned in a number of reports, including on statelessness and hate speech in social media, to be very specific. The world is facing an impending humanitarian crisis, and worse, if we're not careful, if we don't respond appropriately, if the United Nations doesn't acknowledge that here is a situation which will create instability in the region, perhaps in the world, if we do not address, because we're dealing with millions of people. Think what has happened with the Rohingya in Myanmar. 1 million members of a minority who were denied citizenship. Right now, and my colleague referred to it, in Assam, we are looking at possibly 2 million people being denied citizenship. And possibly more, because there are other parts of India who are looking at this model, the Assam model of determination of citizenship for their own area. We are talking millions of possibly stateless or people becoming stateless, no citizenship. And if you think about the vulnerability of not only yourself, but your family, your children, because if you're denied citizenship, access to employment, to land, to even education can be very easily denied. We are creating the conditions of potentially dramatic humanitarian crisis right in front of our eyes right now. The international community did not respond at the right time in relation to the Rohingya. And look at the mess we have today. 1 million. Think what could happen if we allow 2, 3, maybe more, 4 million people denied citizenship. And there is clearly discriminatory legislation, as my mandate and others have pointed out, in the laws that allow a distinct pathway to obtaining citizenship, as was mentioned also earlier. There is a legislation called the Citizenship Amendment Act, which actually excludes Muslims from the pathways to citizenship and actually prefers individuals of particular religions. Not only the quantity, but qualitatively, things have also changed dramatically in India. The list of human rights violations, the communications that we have received at the United Nations are, I think I can use the word, deeply disturbing. Harassment, arrest, detention, and even disappearance of human rights defenders. Usually, by the way, these human rights defenders who disappear quite often are those who defend minorities. Extrajudicial killings, torture, lynchings. Again, more often than not, if you start looking very closely, they involve minorities. The victims are minorities more often than not. Usually Muslims, let's be honest. The numbers are there. The dramatic and, again, disturbing rise of hate speech in social and other media, including even calls to genocide against certain minorities, specifically Muslim minority in some contexts. Not by anyone, by the way. Different individuals, yes, but sometimes high-profile individuals with little or no consequences. You have also the specific targeting and dehumanizing of minority women. We've seen it with Dalit women. We've seen it with Muslim women also, even in the case of certain software programs that are used on the internet. I won't go into the details. The loss and destruction of property of religious and other minorities, including places of worship, restrictions on their livelihood or access to education, the list goes on and on. But I'd like to actually illustrate what we mean. It's sometimes by being very general, we don't really capture the horrific nature of what is being done. We have situations, for example, where minority Dalit and Adivasi human rights defenders have been threatened and attacked. Police protection, for some reason, does not appear or disappears for these human rights defenders. We have the arrest and torture of human rights defenders, and even the death of at least one, and I think there are more, of a Muslim minority right defender in police in custody. These are amongst the communications that are publicly available in the database that I mentioned earlier. We have the extrajudicial killings of members of indigenous tribes. And what happens is that the authorities, police and other authorities, fail to investigate or delay, or, well, you can read the communications. There are many ways of actually making sure that justice is denied when we are dealing with, well, we're only dealing with certain minorities that are not deemed by this particular government, it would seem, to be worthy of equal protection and respect. Female minority Muslim students are prevented from wearing the jihad. Housing and property destruction targeting minority Muslims and low-income communities. Failure to conduct investigations on a large number of extrajudicial killings and disappearances in Kashmir because, well, they are mainly minority individuals. Muslim minority. Destruction or obstruction and destruction of Muslim and Christian-owned businesses. Farmers' protests, by the way, which has an ethnic minority dimension, because during the farmers' protests, where you had massive a crackdown on the demonstrations, other activities connected with the farmers' protests in India, many of these individuals were actually members of the Sikh minority. And the demonizing of the Sikh minority that you could find in India in social media and by politicians and others is mind-boggling. And the inaction of the authorities, and in fact the repression by authorities, is actually also deeply disturbing. So there's a crackdown on media, there's a crackdown, as you know, on civil society organizations, even the banning of certain radio or television programs that are critical of the government, and also the banning or ejection, kicking out of certain civil society human rights organizations from India. So crackdown on dissent and those who actually criticize the policies of the government. You know, I assume, that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are persona non grata in India today. Actually, so am I, but that's besides the point anyway. Revocation of autonomy in Indian-administered Kashmir and other regions where Muslims were a majority and able to have significant political representation and role is a discriminatory practice. This I raised with colleagues also in one of our communications, and it affects millions of people on the basis of who they are, their religious beliefs. We could also say, in some cases, their ethnicity. Gender-based violent attacks against Dalit and Adivasi women has to be referred to, acknowledged, addressed much more solidly. That is not what is happening today in India. Clearly, authorities respond differently if it is a Dalit woman that is the victim of a rape or a murder. And we've seen this in many areas. The list goes on, but my time does not go on. Let me end by going back to the beginning. India has changed, but not for the better, to say the least. It is not for me to say whether it is a democracy or, as one institute on democracy based in Sweden concluded this year, an electoral autocracy. However, there's no doubt that the widespread, massive persecution and even atrocities committed against certain minorities with impunity, condonation, or even support from state authorities is difficult to reconcile with a democracy. To summarize in 4 words, what we have in terms of denial of the human rights of mainly minorities is grave and massive, even systematic and horrific. If I can step away for just a moment and speak not as a special rapporteur, but as a private individual who, like many, have admired India for its rich past of inclusion, tolerance, and diversity, including the legacy of those social reformers, philosophers, or writers who have had so much influence for many of us. Think of Gandhi, think of Tagore and others. What we are not seeing is a perversion of what India can